Okay, hi, morning, Gareth.
Morning, James.
Pleased you join me. I hope it's a little bit less miserable where you are than where I am, because it's grey and horrible, to be honest, as I'm looking at the sky.
It's been miserable to good, I think, by current standards.
And you're in London now, so where have you come in from?
I cycle in from Fulham to our office in Embankment.
Well, that's rather nice. That's
very brisk 30-minute cycle.
It's getting cold though.
Yes, yeah. So wrapped up with gloves and that sort of thing. But I'm also on my new electric bike, which means I don't put as much effort in, so I get colder.
I'm steering. There's two things I steer away from. Number one is sort of virtual books. I struggle with the concept, because for me the tangibility of a book is so wonderful that I can never convert. And the other one is, I mean, electric bikes, I think, are
yeah, I know a lot of people in that camp, but I guarantee you'll convert at some point. And when I say electric bike, you're still pedaling. So anyway, that's a whole new. You could do a whole new session on that. But if you ever want to be persuaded on electric bikes, I'm your
I'm not a cyclist. I've never been a cyclist. I'm a bit too tall and a bit too big. But I've signed myself up for an ultra triathlon next year. So I'm going to have to learn that discipline. I'm not.
There is a real estate angle to all this, which is the reason I have an electric bike, is so I don't arrive at work all sweaty, so I don't have to have a shower and all that sort of thing. And the reason I don't want to have a shower is because most office buildings don't have particularly good shower locker facilities and that sort of thing. So it's a real estate issue. You see, if they're really high end of trip amenities, then I might be persuaded to just arrive and basically arrive all sweaty and have my suit hung up in a locker, that sort of thing. But the other, I
love the segue. I thought you were about to say something. Hang on. I thought you were going to say it was something to do with the MIPIM cycle, and that you were going to do a electric bike to MIPIM.
Probably not. I just get there.
Long way to go. Anyway, right. So randomly, we just started this in a completely innocuous way. For those of you who have seen these interviews before, this is all of the interview research that myself and Dr. Amy Redmond are doing for our book writing, which is around digital transformation, innovation, leadership within the built world. And as always, we know that not all of the insights that we gather are going to be able to get into the book, and there's always going to be people that we're interviewing who are real leaders globally in this sector, that we think that there'll be interesting insights that you can pull from the interviews that we do. So we're actually streaming them all and creating a massive bank of recorded content for everybody, so that hopefully we're increasing that transparency of insight for everybody. And Gareth, thanks ever so much for agreeing to come on. So do you just want to give a little bit of an introduction as to yourself and your role within PwC? I think that would be interesting for everyone.
Sure, yeah, and thanks for having me on, James. So just leading up, I guess, to where I am currently at PwC, I'll start with that and say I work within our real estate lead advisory practice at PwC, based here in London. I've been there for 7, coming on 8 years, I think. So I do 2 main roles there. First of all is part of our corporate finance team, working on M&A activity, whether that's originating transactions, working on the buy side or sell side on real estate related transactions, and I sit within the board of real estate lead advisory team, but I also lead the firm's research and thought leadership for real estate, and perhaps the most obvious thing you would have come across potentially would be our emerging trends in real estate report research series that we do in partnership with the Urban Land Institute. So those 2 things, at least in my mind, fit very well together. It gives me a really privileged insight of where the industry thinks the real estate market is going generally, but it also obviously ties into my sort of day job in working on transactions, and helps us to identify opportunities and advise clients on that. I think very briefly, in terms of how I got there, I started off many years ago as an accountant, tax advisor in another big four, firm, then spent quite a bit of time working in industry representative roles. So I worked originally for the British Property Federation with Liz Peace when we were persuading the UK government to introduce REIT legislation back in 2007. So 2 very intense, enjoyable years there, working with the government and industry, and then did a similar role working for EPRA, the European organisation that represents listed property companies around Europe, with some aspects of a similar role, promoting the REIT regime, but also representing the industry in discussions with national governments, the European Commission, and helping sort of improve the environment for the real estate market. And I think, the common thread amongst a lot of those has been quite privileged to spend a lot of time at different levels within real estate companies, and particularly at the C-suite. So always been interested in the strategy of real estate companies and how that could evolve and how that is evolving.
I mean, how are you finding the market at the moment in terms of that thought leadership narrative, just out of pure interest? Where are we at as an industry? What are you finding, the sort of the advisory narrative is at the moment?
Well, I think there's, particularly at the current time, where there's a bit of, I guess, inertia and deals are taking longer, and less transactions are happening. I think this is the lowest level of real estate transactions we've had for the last 13 years in Europe. So there's quite a lot of strategic thinking, next steps, but there's also a good reason for that. There's a number of, I think, structural changes that are hitting the market. We've been through the structural impact of e-commerce on retail, and now we've got the whole dispersed working from home impact of the office market. And then I suppose the other big one is probably 2 other big ones: technology, and then the whole ESG decarbonisation story. So there's a lot of reasons why people might be pausing, and I think one of the big takeaway conclusions from my side from our emerging trends report is the fact that people are going to have to make some quite big calls if they want to do anything meaningful perhaps in 2024. These are quite tricky times, and reading the market is difficult. Valuations are there's a big obviously gap in between bid and ask spreads, and quite a lot of uncertainty out there.
Yeah, it's fascinating as a market dynamic time. And I got a sense, and by the way, the emerging trends report, for anyone who hasn't read it, and it's, how many years have you been doing it now? Because it's a few, isn't it?
In Europe, we've been doing it 20 years. Sorry, this is the 21st year, and in the States, quite a bit longer than that. I don't actually know. It might even be twice that, but it's been going for a long time.
But it's almost, I can't even imagine how that gets pulled together. I was reading I suppose the North American one recently, and actually I shared a quote in it this morning, which I might come and ask your comment on.
Mm-hmm.
But it's quite extraordinary. I think the one I was reading was like over 60,000 words. It's intense. But what I quite like about it is it doesn't feel like a normal industry report. It's very relaxed in its writing style, which means it's quite approachable in its learning. I think my favourite one this morning, when I was rereading it, was I'd missed the quotations of Jim Carrey in Dumb and Dumber was in the report, and I just thought, this is not a PwC industry report. This has been written by somebody who's got a sense of humour and is able to pull on outside influence to actually make sense of some of the complexity. But
yeah, you're right. It is quite unique, and quite unique, I think, for a firm like PwC to be working with. But I think the point is always that it is about getting the views of the market, and what I like doing is to think before we go out and do the actual survey and do the interviews, like what questions might we ask, what are the areas we might try and tease out of people. But it does, I always say you don't generally get a huge amount of light bulb moments coming out of the report. You get occasionally, but what it does do sometimes is just strengthen and confirm ways in which the market's evolving in a way that's, as you described, quite sort of relaxed, and I think overall quite helpful to people. Occasionally, and I think this is what I love about it, is we do get a real sense of some proper emerging trends that are happening,
Yeah.
that perhaps the industry isn't really talking about at large.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think the uniqueness of it, whilst this isn't a conversation to extol the virtues of PwC's reports in any way, but for me, they strike the right balance between, and this is what I suppose I come to from a lot of the speaking work and the emceeing work that I do, which is there's a balance between the serious nature of the asset and the market that we're in, balance that with sort of some light-hearted elements, and I've always been a big believer that if you get the right balance, people will take more out of it than just a very serious black and white, quite monotone report or speaking, whatever it might be. So, congratulations. But the one thing I really took from the report, and I'd like your thoughts on this, because I'm very curious about that. There seems to be this feeling of pent-up frustration in the market, because on the one side you've got an awful lot of stress in the market. You've got the struggles around valuation, you've got the struggles around market sort of cap rates coming down drastically because rents aren't quite there, but you've got high occupancy. And it doesn't matter if it's in multifamily or in office, you've got stressed assets on one side, but then on the other, you've also got this massive opportunity to make real hay while the sun is shining on the distressed assets. So I don't quite know if the market knows where it is, and perhaps that's why it's in, as you said, the lowest area of transactions almost ever, and there's this inertia. Do you feel that's fair, or is there another reason for it at the moment?
Yeah, I do think that's fair, and that sort of narrative around the big calls that need to be made. There's also an element of what drives different businesses, what time frames are they thinking about in terms of their investment decisions. I mean, arguably, if you're an institutional investor, and I have heard this narrative from the bigger institutional investors who will say we're not that spooked by particularly whether we've hit the bottom of the market or not. We go into these sectors because we're long-term investors. I think there's some truth in that, but I wouldn't say I've heard it or seen a great deal of evidence of that. Those sort of big calls being made yet. I think I haven't
either. I think there's a lot of in a lot of the conferences I've done, and this is in particular in Eastern Europe, where there's the interesting thing about this conference organisers, they have economists as opening keynote speakers, and it's always brilliant because I don't get that in any other conferences that I take part in. And they have what I would call a cautiously optimistic perspective on where it's all going. Obviously, inflation coming down, but what they're talking about is there's now insecurity around commodity prices, which is then impacting where the real estate markets go. So we're in this big period of uncertainty, which is then creating this inertia, which means that people are, what do we do? Where do we go? How do we sort of take the next step? So I suppose I'm interested from your perspective, given your sort of the research side, the thought leadership side, and the sort of the advisory around the M&A and the finance structures. How are you seeing the evolution of this sort of real estate market and the built environment more broadly? What are your perspectives on it?
There's quite a lot to unpick there, I guess.
Yeah, a hell of a lot. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I suppose just step back from that to start with. I think one thing I've noticed since we launched the report is almost like it feels like there's two camps within real estate. You've almost got the camp which is saying we are in a downturn. We don't quite know where we are in the cycle, but we are in a cycle, and at some point the market's going to come back, and we're going to be able to invest into markets and ride yield compression in the same way that real estate's worked for many cycles previously. If you happen to be holding secondary office at this point in time, bad luck. I'm disappearing and I go come back when I can see that sort of market cycle opportunity again. I think so. That's sort of one camp which probably feels a bit more traditional, old school real estate, and then you have the other camp which is sort of more like we are in a new environment. We have to reassess how we view risk and opportunity, timeframes of investing, and these are really exciting times where to be in the real estate industry and huge opportunities. So I mean, clearly not everyone's sitting in, it's not quite as polarized as that, but I think we're definitely I've definitely noticed that in terms of the feedback, if you like, since we launched the report and had events and panel discussions and meetings with clients and things. So and I do remember saying feeling a similar way actually when we had the GFC and the downturn then, thinking, well, is this now a reset for the industry? Are we going to start? Is the industry going to become more embrace more like operational risk and focus on the customer? And is real estate going to become a much more of a business like many others, rather than seen through that lens of being a financial asset and an alternative to bonds? But actually, I think what happened is we had the period of low interest rates, and everyone just broadly speaking, there was that sort of momentum from yield compression. So I might be proved wrong in 5-10 years time when we've seen that we go through another cycle where people invest reasonably sensibly and get yield compression. But I personally, I do think things are different, and a number of factors lead me to think that. One is this point around decarbonisation and ESG does feel like it's a very real one that is exerting a lot of pressure on our industry in particular. And the other is, we've obviously seen some quite substantial changes in the office market, which is the biggest, I think, still the biggest real estate sector, and that is undoubtedly going through a structural change, not necessarily a bad one, and presenting huge opportunities, but nevertheless requiring a different product. So I do think, and there are probably other factors as well. I think the demographic story and the fact that we have that massively growing elderly population and everyone from close to retiring to needing assisted living. There's a huge gap there that the real estate market hasn't historically served very well, at least in Europe, I don't think. So I suppose to answer your question,
I'm thinking in my head, I'm going, my question had many layers and your answer just had many layers to it as well. And I'm writing frantically about all the different things I want to pick up on.
But if I can remember your question, it was all around how does it feel how is the industry feeling in terms of what's needed?
Well, yeah, it's about, I mean, you and I sort of went back and forth before this, and you talked about the general evolution of real estate. So that was a sort of the area. But perhaps before we go in on that, you mentioned some really interesting things, and I'm going to bring it back to the report, and then hopefully it'll give us a launch pad to go into that evolution. You mentioned about the global financial crisis. You mentioned about the industry being very cyclical, and that there being two camps. So my first question of those two things was in the original report, it was talking about the GFC being quite an unhealthy cycle. It was expected to be this great reset, as I think is a term that you use in the report, the great reset, but actually it wasn't really. It was a bit artificial. It was a bit unhealthy. Whereas the prediction now is that the cycle we're currently in feels like it comes from a better place. It feels like the reset the industry needed, and that it might be the market the industry needed, and the correct cycle, whereas the GFC perhaps wasn't. Is that an okay interpretation of it?
Yeah, that's said much more succinctly than I could have said. But yeah, I agree. I mean, it felt at the time, I thought this could be a healthy reset, but it turned out to be, I think, an unhealthy one.
Yeah, and why was that? Why was it an unhealthy reset? Because it was artificial. Yeah. It wasn't expected.
Because of the quantitative easing, low interest rates just meant that there was a yield compression that was driven by that factor, rather than necessarily delivering better quality product, creating income growth through going into sectors with the right sort of underpins operating.
Right. So it was like an artificial stimulant to the sector. It wasn't.
Yeah, it gave people the opportunity to make a lot of money not without necessarily having to work that hard for it. And I'm that's appreciate there's a huge spectrum of businesses doing some really great stuff during that time. So I don't want to get myself in trouble, but I think.
But that's the other thing which comes very clear, which is obviously there are so many different asset classes and then geographical variants within the asset classes, and that is incredibly clear in everything that is written by you guys. And I think that is something which I speak about all the time, which is all of the learnings that I have and all of the people that I interview genuinely have a very siloed view, in particular a geographically siloed view of their market, their asset class, and their asset class in their geographical silo. And very, very rarely do people who I interview or talk about or talk to in conferences, wherever it may be, very, very rarely do people have a much broader spectrum, both asset and geo. And I think that's that's very rare from the stuff that you guys are producing. But going back onto that, you mentioned there being two sort of markets at the moment. The sort of the usual cycle market, the people who believe this is what always happens, that the real estate market is cyclical, it'll come out the other side. And then you said that there's a separate group and a train of thought, which is perhaps progressing that line on a little bit. Where do you sit at the moment? Are you feeling this is just another cycle, it maybe just a little bit more extreme, or do you feel that we've entered an entirely new period within the way that the industry operates?
I think I definitely sit in the latter camp. That this is a new environment, but I'm also conscious that I've been wrong in the past, and also sometimes the unknown is the time frame around how these things happen. I'm also conscious that consultants often get accused of trying to say like the time is now, the time to react is now for obvious reasons. So I have to sort of temper it with all of that. But I suppose the thing that's always interested me generally about real estate and in my sort of personal motivations is where you have clear trends that are happening, external impacts that are so obvious that you can't avoid them, and yet sometimes that doesn't really flow through in the strategy of businesses playing into that market. And so the impact of climate, environment, ESG is a really good example of that, because it's like there couldn't be anything more extreme than the future of the planet and the signs and everything. So how do businesses react to that? You could make the same point about, in my mind, the impact of technology leading to more dispersed work patterns. Yes, the pandemic was a thing that accelerated that, but again, that's not a really complicated theory to get your head around, is it? Like, as technology gets better, we're not going to need to be gathered around each other as often. I also think the demographic story is another one which is so blindingly clear. That's not the right expression, but it's so clear, and yet the consequences of what that might mean for demand for real estate, thinking about real estate in particular, don't really have as much clarity in terms of, you don't see that in terms of the strategies that businesses are how they're reacting to that.
So just to explore that element of the demographical shift, are you referring to what you mentioned earlier on about the sort of what is called the later living market, or are you talking about the Generation Z coming into the market, or both maybe?
Yeah, I guess it's both, because ultimately it's how that dynamic changes, but I think the most obvious thing is that bulge of growing elderly population moving through the system, and what that might mean in terms of housing needs, and but you could have it's not an area I thought about quite so much, but it equally has an impact on the needs of the younger generation. It could have an impact on the financial burden on younger generations, and how they then live their lives, how they go through the educational system, and how they shape their careers. I mean, it impacts everything, but I think the most obvious one is that growing elderly population, because we know it's going to happen.
Yeah, it does.
But
Just on that, I remember so clearly. I did years ago. Back in my marketing days, I remember a developer was hosting a round table for all of the UK house builders, and it was moderated by Esther Ransom. And I will never forget that interview because she was incredible. I mean, she was in a room filled with, very sadly, white middle class men who were running the house building sector. These were all the top house builders.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a discussion all about later living. And the two big debates were, what name should we give our developments? Because there's consternation around it being an over 55s or retirement living was not the right word. So I found that quite almost a silly debate, but apparently very, very serious in the narrative form. And actually, it was only yesterday, I think, I heard the term later living. And I thought, actually, that's a better way of putting it. But Esther Ransom was incredible, and because she really drove the conversation around these developers, really pulling their socks up to get them sorted. And the one thing I will always remember, she said, look, you have to remember that the people who are later living all they've done is retired from work. They haven't retired from life.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was a brilliant way of framing the entire discussion and argument.
Yeah,
it was very stark.
But I think just at the other end as well of the spectrum, you also got people moving from university into cities, and the type of accommodation in terms of affordability and quality that meets them, and who are the right people to be providing that. I mean, at the moment it seems to be segregated. You've got student accommodation providers, and then a different group of people providing the young living market. But I think that will change. I remember the CEO.
By young living, are you talking more on sort of the new word of sort of co-living? Is that?
It could be a co-living product. Again, that's a sector that maybe is not that well defined, but effectively you could just think of there's a spectrum of living needs all the way from student up to later living. And does it make sense for that to be sort of segregated in quite the way it is at the moment? I remember the CEO of Vonovia once saying at a conference around, I think what he was saying is I think they do provide a pretty broad spectrum of end users, occupiers in their properties. But he was saying the only reason why we should lose a tenant once we've got them in is if they die. So it's basically saying that, they would, once you've got someone in at whatever life stage they're at, the aim should be to try and move them from different types of accommodation through their life.
That's a really interesting way of looking at it, isn't it? So it's like a whole of life tenant.
Yeah, I mean, I'm guessing that was an aspiration rather than a reality for them. But
yeah, no, that makes sense. So let's try and be a little bit succinct in terms of bringing that all around. I know you're passionate about the evolution of the sort of the real estate industry. So how would you put everything that we've just talked about from an office and, let's say, office and residential for now? How do you see this evolving? Because you said earlier on, we require a new product. Mm-hmm. So how do you see this evolution manifesting itself?
Well, the best way I've sort of described it in my mind is the idea that real estate is becoming a much more complex product. So moving away from the provision, or moving away from the sort of real estate's a financial asset type process. And this is actually something we've been exploring in the emerging trends interviews as well. It's sort of a similar argument to this or similar theme to the idea that real estate and infrastructure is becoming more overlapping more. Real estate, players needing to get more involved in the operational side of businesses in order to make returns. But I think as a very broad sort of description of what I see happening over time is that real estate is becoming a much more complex product. That includes being closer to the customer, understanding the future needs of generations, and ultimately providing the right real estate to meet those needs. And another way of describing it, which I think is links to the sort of whole big question at the moment around ESG and decarbonisation, and some element of frustration coming back from the discussions we have with players in the industry around the moving target of regulation and increasing burden on regulation, KPIs, investor expectations around ESG performance. And that's this whole idea of real estate being seen more broadly as social infrastructure. If you think of real estate as social infrastructure, then it encourages a different view of what is high quality real estate. And I think real estate is a very complex product. Take something like what was previously a city office building. In the future, that's probably going to become much more mixed in terms of the range of different occupiers and facilities. It might take into account how people travel to and from that building. How it integrates into the local area with the whole sort of dispersed work we talked about. That the positive impact of a really high quality office ticking all those boxes is going to be huge in terms of bringing people into the area and the indirect impacts of it. So it's sort of switching the mindset a bit from what's the environmental ESG performance of a building, the 4 square walls of the building, and how is it actually how is it producing the most overall positive impact to the environment in which it sits. And now I talked to an office example, but I think you could equally make a case thinking about a traditional warehouse logistics facility. That's becoming, I mean, at the moment, one of the reasons why logistics was always an under invested sector, or wasn't seen as a particularly sexy sector, was because it's just very straightforward. But now the whole logistics supply chain, energy usage, energy storage, how it interacts with the EV fleet charging, it's becoming a much more complex overall ecosystem. So again, back to this point around real estate becoming more complex, I think that's where I see the industry going. So the people who create the most value in these different sectors are going to be the people that think of it in those terms. And as I said, the social infrastructure point is a helpful way of framing that, I think.
Yeah, I think it is, and I think it's quite a unique way of thinking about it. And you've really jogged my sort of thought process as you were going through that, because I've never thought of it like that. I've very much agreed with the complexity issue, having seen. Funnily enough, I was in, of all places, Uruguay, and it's a case study I talk about a lot, where they converted an old glass warehouse in the center of Montevideo into the epitome of mixed asset use. So the ground floor was mixed co-retail. So it was very much that sort of pop-up shop, and I would call it pop-up plus, where they sort of, they then extended leases out, but it was very much co-retail. Middle floor was co-working. Top floor was co-living. And talking to the developers, they just said, look, we have unique market dynamics in Uruguay, which is we have a lot of transient sort of professional living, where people come for a 6-month to 12-month contract, and they don't want to have to travel very far to work. So we started with the co-working. Then they said, well, actually, we love what you've done. Can we now live in the, essentially in the unit? So they built that out. So, that complexity, I totally agree with you in the mixed asset class. Mm-hmm. But I mean, for all of this uniqueness and for all of the side that I agree with you on, the one bit I'm struggling with when it comes to leadership within the real estate market, and this is really for me a narrative that I'm forming, where as leaders we are probably quite understandably, and if you read the Emerging Trends report, you'll get my perspective here. Real estate leaders of large multinational or national traditional companies are looking very short term at the moment, and they're protecting cash flow. They're protecting the business in the short term, and I'm arguing that they're struggling to look outside of that short term factors. And so when you're talking about the complexity the market has and where we think the market's going to go, how do you feel the leaders of these large companies, how can they cope with that sort of potential theme that's going to come out over the next 10 to 20 years? How do you see that working?
Well,
I don't know the answer.
No. I mean, it is really difficult, but it is, I think, probably the biggest barrier to sort of moving in this direction we've talked about. I mean, clearly having a vision around, you know, what is a super piece of mixed use real estate is great, but at some point you've got to get the financing, stick the spade in the ground, and commit to a product, and you have to sell that product to people whose mindset is the here and now. And you know, so necessarily arguing around, well, I believe in 15 years time this is what everyone's going to want, is a very difficult thing to do. But I remember, can't remember.
Almost impossible, Gareth.
In
the market that we're in at the moment, where banks are about to get screwed, and you know, I'm going to read you out the piece that I shared this morning, because I think it absolutely encompasses the struggles of not just necessarily the real estate industry, but actually the banking sector, the finance, the insurance sector, which, you know, if you're a leader trying to convince somebody that not just we're stockpiling now for the short term, but we're preparing our business for the future. So the extract I took this morning was, I'll just read it verbatim. So the bigger problem for the industry is the wall of debt coming due that must be refinanced. The MBA estimates that over $725 billion of commercial and multifamily mortgages mature in 2023, with another $1.2 trillion maturing over the following 2 years, representing over 40% of the $4.4 trillion of outstanding CRE mortgages. Much of this debt will be refinanced at higher interest rates, although some lenders will agree to extend and pretend to postpone the difficult choices on the lending conditions are more favorable, until lending conditions are more favorable. One investment manager said banks are struggling to figure out what to do. They might be willing to negotiate extensions with owners because they don't want to write down their loan portfolios and they don't want to own these assets. Other lenders are exploring different types of debt-equity, various flavors of financing that combine elements of both debt and equity to plug gaps in the capital stack. So, you know, we've got this, let's push the can down, or kick the can down the road a little bit in the financing aspect of it, let alone just the real estate attitude. So I put it to you that this is an almost impossible job for visionary leaders to become the ambidextrous organization that we need, i.e. look after the short term whilst preparing for the long term, when every factor that they need to look after the long term is probably suffering the same challenges that they have at the minute. So is that an unfair thing?
No, I mean,
around that?
We see quite a lot of the sort of the bit in between, you know, pre-distress, but when businesses are trying to work around. So very conscious of that through the guys in our sort of restructuring team and others. But I think your point's absolutely right, and I've sort of thought about this quite a lot. And I suppose, you know, we talked about those two camps, and you got the traditional real estate, and then you got the visionary side, let's call it. How do you? The reality is you're probably just trying to move somewhere along that line, because certain things like, you know, where the current market is, the gap between the reality and valuations, and the real genuine difficulties in being a visionary in that context, I guess. So I'm sort of thinking about how do we as an industry move a bit further along that line. And I suppose it's helpful to look at other industry sectors. I always think of you know, a business that's a pharmaceutical company, for example, that is trying to create a new drug or to deal with a particular new illness or old illnesses, and they're investing, you know, huge amounts of upfront R&D in products that may or may not work. So, you know, other industries do really invest in that side of the business and take, I think, quite big risks on that side of the business. And then I suppose another part of that is you look at a business like you know, Apple and Steve Jobs and what Apple did in terms of almost telling the consumer where they needed to be. You know, the brand, the research, the sort of genius, if you like, of those companies. But they're creating a product and then they're working towards it. And you know, there must be huge amounts that were invested in understanding that market. So I suppose it's valid to say that industries like that are over here, and real estate historically hasn't done a great deal of that. And what we're saying is, if real estate can move slightly up that line, and that's where I think it's in a way it ties in a little bit to the whole question around brand, which I'm always been interested in the real estate brand, and how people who produce and operate real estate can use brand, create a brand, and that helps to move towards this sort of more visionary type model. But it is very difficult, and I guess in a way, just linking it back to that social infrastructure point. And if businesses think of themselves, or real estate businesses think of themselves as social infrastructure, and others think of them as part of social infrastructure through the same sort of mind frame, then you can start bringing in a much wider range of benefits that back you when you're maybe having conversations with finances, and they go, yeah, okay, so think of King's Cross 25 years ago when that was conceived as a project. There would have been some quite narrow visions, I suppose, for that, and it changed hands, and developers went bust or whatever. But I suppose the core thing behind that was I think a story that never went away, which is this is part of one of the biggest successful cities in the world. It needs investment. It's run down, but long term, this is going to be an amazing opportunity. So if we had an institutional investor that came in right at the start, backed it, and said, we're in this for 100 years, it wouldn't matter so much around the sort of financing side of things at the start, but because your vision would be backed up by some really cool things like demographics, urbanization, and you could almost said, well, we're going to make money from this at some point. We don't quite know how we're going to get there, but believe in our brand, our vision, and we'll get there. And as it happened, it changed hands lots of times, and it has been a success, but probably not in the most efficient way it could be.
And I would say exactly the same thing happened with Battersea Power Station.
Yeah.
It had the brand, and it had a long-term vision that the immense amount of money invested in that from the developer side. It's not going to seek a return in 10 years. It's going to seek a return in a much longer time than that. But it's really interesting about the element of brand. And so I'm very conscious. I said that we'd probably be 30 to 40 minutes. We're already at 42.
Wow.
So I'm just conscious that we've got, I know you've got a dash. So I've got two sort of final questions. So I want to explore that element of brand. I think it's really interesting. There's not many people who get it. And then I want to sort of finish on that, the classic ESG discussion that we see all over. I'd love your perspectives on that as a sector, and obviously what PwC are seeing. So talk to me about brand. And real estate businesses, I think, historically are terrible at this. So what are your feelings around this? What are you advising?
I'm not sure what I'm advising. I mean,
I'd just like to know your angle on it, because I think for me, WeWork created a brand, and I think they did brilliantly at that, by the way.
Yeah.
But I suspect you're not thinking along that line.
Not as such. No. I mean, my sort of experience when I mentioned I worked for the British Property Federation, so at the time we went through a big exercises of trying to improve the brand of the industry as a whole, which I think was successful, mainly helpful in terms of sense of understanding quite how bad our brand was at that point in time. I've also done, with EPRA, always conscious of how we're seen by external investors, but also regulators as well. So had different levels of involvement of that, and I think the industry has started to get better at least presenting some facts around the good that real estate does, and I do think that's really important. I think where I'm going a little bit was again linked to the social infrastructure point, really, which is that there's real estate, as I said, a complex asset. It is a complex asset class, a complex service. That complexity isn't necessarily taken on board by the people who are producing the real estate and operating it, but it's there. I mean, we live in, we spend all our time in real estate, and we are complex beings. So it is a complex asset class. And we need to get better at explaining all the different ways in which good real estate creates value. And that's way beyond what is currently seen as creating value, i.e., the RICS Red Book valuation. So I think there's a journey to go on there that is starting to happen. I was talking to Natalie Paladicev from Ivanhoe Cambridge, and they're working on a green IRR to go alongside their real estate valuations, and I think other organisations like APG have come up with a sort of asset quality rating to go alongside their valuation. So there's a journey we're going on where we're getting better at explaining what makes good high quality real estate. And I think that's a big part of it, just getting that message across to the industry around what real estate is.
So segueing a little bit to the next conversation, next question around ESG, and the reason I ask this is because I remember a similar narrative a few years back in the construction sector, saying that the construction sector has a serious lack of sort of the new brains coming into the sector. We weren't attracting the best graduates because we were seen as a very archaic, traditional industry, and we weren't innovating at all in construction. And the only way that we're able to brand the sector better is if we become more innovative and obviously are then able to attract the best intelligence into the sector. So I don't think we've necessarily done it with innovation and technology, because I don't think we've necessarily been at the forefront of the industry demanding change and challenging the sector on innovation and technology. But I put it to you that maybe this is where ESG is actually quite attractive for us, given the challenges we have around embodied carbon, given the challenges that we have with our buildings and the amount of responsibility we have as a sector. Could this be the sort of the gateway drug to branding the sector differently? Because we have some serious challenges, and if we really do take it quite seriously, we're going to be branding the industry in a much more positive light.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a fair thing?
Yes, I think it is. I struggle to think of a sector where there's such a broad range of potential impacts, good and bad, but tend to be think of it from a positive perspective. We spend most of our time in real estate, and the huge ways in which we can deliver value. I do sense, and I feel this myself, a bit of frustration, as I mentioned at the start, around a sort of narrow framework of criteria by which good real estate is potentially being judged. And that, I don't want to shy away from this idea, but I think it ties into the point really around complexity again, which is that real estate's complex. We need to find ways of communicating that and describing what high quality complex real estate looks like. And I also, this is maybe a slightly controversial view, but I do think we are in danger of tying ourselves up in knots a little bit around technology and innovation, where in some cases there are some very, very straightforward things that could be done to improve the impact of real estate. And in some cases that's not building it, or taking a different view on a longer term view and around need and that sort of stuff. But there's also and this is a bit of a segue into a sort of a passion of mine, which I may have mentioned previously, which is around, how do people travel to and from buildings? And I guess the other really obvious sort of thing that's impacted society over the last 50 years or so is that car-dependent culture. So how do we move away from a car-dependent culture? These aren't complicated things. These are simple ways in which I think the ESG impact of society could be improved, and yet somehow they're not really focused on particularly, because they certainly don't fit into that innovation bucket. I don't think, they're just basic common sense. But there's a lot of reasons why we don't we don't invest so much in those types of simple ideas. So on the one hand, I'm saying real estate getting more complex. We need to get more and more sophisticated about how we communicate that complexity to stakeholders. But on the other hand, there's a whole load of simple things that could be done that currently aren't done, where the real estate industry could take a big lead on.
The no shit Sherlock solutions, as I like to call them, which sadly we don't necessarily look at. So look, just finally then, give me a sort of a wax lyrical for me on the ESG side of things. I know it takes a considerable amount of space in your reports at the moment. Where are we as an industry? Where are the geographical challenges and differences that you see? What's the industry genuinely doing about that?
Well, I think it's still fair to say that there's a large chunks of the industry that aren't doing much, or as much as they should do. I also think it's fair to say that there, huge numbers who are doing, making huge efforts and big strides in this area. As I sort of reflected on, I think that I see a challenge over the next 10 years of in some cases, the indirect impacts of following a particular framework of ESG criteria might end up leading away from the production of overall highly impactful, high quality real estate. So I think that's a journey we've got to go through as an industry. And I think in terms of our research, we're sensing that through, I suppose, an element of frustration. And there are some examples where an impact fund can't invest in a particular type of asset class because it just doesn't tick the ESG box. Whereas you could make a case that it's over, if you took into account the overall impact, it is probably a positive, but that wouldn't be captured within current ESG frameworks. I think another area that's quite interesting, and it links into sort of scope 3 type scope 4 areas, is you look at the whole discussion around the M&S building on Oxford Street. Should it be retrofit or should it be knocked down and rebuilt? I don't know the details of that in terms of what is ultimately the right answer. I don't think anyone does at the moment, but I'm pretty sure that the answer is probably going to be marginal. I.e., it could be, if you took into account everything, all the impacts of this new development, say, it would be a different answer to where we've arrived at. In other words, the planning decision has probably been built on incomplete information. And I think once you bring in scope 3 and scope 4 type sophisticated analysis, you might get different answers. So I think we're going to see a lot of these types of decisions around the margins where we've gone one way, not the other, and you have to make a decision. But in some cases, we don't have the information to really be able to make those decisions. So that whole scope 3, I suppose, indirect fringe impacts is going to become much more important, I think, going forward, because it could be the factor between do you do something or do you not do something.
Yeah, and I'm in huge agreement with you on the scope 3 side. I wasn't familiar with scope 4. I've just had a look, and that's basically outside of the value chain.
I'm not hugely familiar on it. I don't think many people are, but I mentioned it just to sound impressive. But it's it's sort of some of the less direct stuff.
Yeah, but so scope 4 I've not dealt with at all. Scope 3 I have, because it's one of my fundamental concerns about us as a sector, and I think we're sleepwalking into a scope 3 challenge, which is we're not realizing that we are ultimately responsible for the supply chain. And the reporting on that, unless the leadership really understands their requirements and their responsibilities and their reporting lines, I think we're going to have a problem. I think we're very set on the E bit. I think we're understanding of what we've got to do, but very, very few leaders and their initiatives that I'm hearing really genuinely mention the scope 3 side, because I think it's so hard.
I think a sort of again, slightly controversial point perhaps, but one which I think is an example of where that maybe there's a sort of gap at the moment. In I see no reason why this whole question about demolish versus rebuild and I don't see any reason why a big occupier wouldn't start taking into account the impact of its buying decisions or leasing decisions. So a big corporate occupier, should it move into it, if it moves into a brand new shiny building, should it be taken into account the carbon impact of building that new building by taking a decision to lease a new building versus leasing an existing building. They are encouraging a market of new build. Do you see what I mean? That leasing relationship is a supply relationship of the occupier. So obviously at the moment, if someone's making a decision to move into to lease for 10 years a shiny new, very efficient new building, they're probably getting a lot of credit for that because they're occupying a shiny new energy efficient building. But it's not necessarily the right answer if it's driving a market of people out there going and building.
Other people doing the same thing, which then demands more new builds, which as a consequence, I see your thinking, and I think you're right. And the other chain here, just to finish this all off, is what you're talking about. I think is very geocentric in some elements of Western Europe and the Western democracies. The further east I have gone, the less that attitude comes in, and the more sort of blinkers they are, generalizing here a little bit in terms of what they need to do. And I see that there are certain regions of the world where they are waxing lyrical about their climate initiatives, but I don't think they are authentically leading on it. I think there is some elements of smoke and mirrors a little bit. And then I was in Hong Kong just recently, and listening to some of the attitudes there were quite frightening in terms of. And I say, look at the US with anti-ESG legislation coming in Florida. It's not just that, but there's a lot of backlash about it. So we're in a fascinating, and I think your word complex has come out throughout this entire time. And I think that's where we are. So look, I know you've got a dash, so I'm going to end the stream now, but just publicly while we're here, Gareth, thanks ever so much for all your time.